Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the What the Finance podcast, where we talk to experts to try and figure out what is happening in the markets. So, on today's episode, I'm happy to be hosting Izabella Kaminska, an alumni of the Financial Times and founder and editor of The Blind Spot, a new media venture that aims to shine a light on stories being missed by the wider journalistic pack. So, Izabella, thanks for joining the podcast. And I guess, can you tell us a bit more about your background and how you got into this point now?
Hi, and thank you for having me. So my name is Izabella Kaminska, and I was until recently the editor of FT Alphaville at the Financial Times. And I decided to go crazy and go at it by myself and start my own media venture, which is currently probably a misnomer because it's a one-woman venture, but I hope it will expand as soon as possible. So the idea behind The Blind Spot is to really focus on stories that maybe the rest of the media are shying away from because of sensitivities and complexities, but approaching them in a very rational and credible way, because I think there are a lot of stories out there that need really, credible coverage. But unfortunately, some of them are just being missed for kind of stigma or taboo reasons. And this is impeding the quality of research, and it's actually allowing the less credible alternative media to then control the story. So I noticed that this was happening, and I felt there was a market gap to fill. And I don't want to lower my standards, but I did sense, just being in the mainstream for a while, that there is this certain hesitancy and a risk aversion that is, in my mind, unquestionable. And I don't think it's the product of, any kind of bad, intention by journalists. I feel like it's a groupthink situation, which no one specifically is to blame for, but it manifests as a thing. As in finance, you often see groupthink leading the pack and the sort of consensus out there. And it takes a bit of guts. It does take guts to kind of like push against that crowd perspective. So that's what I wanted to do with The Blind Spot, and do it in a sort of select and very specific controlled way, but also to expand the product and have eventually like a good team of like 4 or 5 reporters focusing on these things. So that's the plan. Whether it manifests or not, I'll let you know.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, did you see a change from maybe people being more willing to go into those conversations that you said maybe aren't pleasant or super complex to just avoiding them?
Well, as an independent. So I think independence comes with pluses and minuses, and that's my experience to date. On the plus side, you can really, you have autonomy over what you can cover. And certainly you're not necessarily restricted in the way that you would be at a mainstream outlet. On the, on the downside, I think what is often neglected, and this is definitely what I'm learning, is that as an independent and as a small entity, you don't have the protection of a large organization. And that protection often actually kind of allows for independence. So small operators can be more easily swayed by their sources because they are small and they are more dependent on revenues. So there is, I think, it's all very glamorous to say, oh, I'm independent, therefore I'm free. But actually, the truth is that as an independent, you are in some ways more corruptible as well. So for me at The Blind Spot, I think it's really important to grow organically, which will take longer, but I think it's important to maintain credibility. Substack obviously is in this market as well, and it makes a big, I'm a big fan of Substack. I want to like emphasize this, but I think what is lost in the Substack conversation is that just because people are getting subscriptions doesn't like protect them from corruption, because nothing stops like a big corporate necessarily calling you up and say, well, if you write nice things about me, I'll take out 20 subscriptions, right? So there's and actually in some ways it's more opaque. At least with advertising, who, it's transparent who's influencing you, right? So there are pluses and minuses, and I'm trying to kind of bridge the best of both worlds, but obviously it will take time. And yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've seen that, I guess, over the past few years as more people crop up online wanting to either sell a product or maybe sell content they're releasing themselves, where, you have to be careful who you're listening to and what are their motives. And I think that's a key thing that I guess there's always motives behind everything that people do, be it trying to get more listens, more follows, or something more sinister, I guess.
Well, exactly, which is why I think transparency is really important, and presenting your organization's values, because I think that's kind of what's happened in the mainstream, is that values have become sort of detached from the masthead values and the organizational values. So a lot of readers are buying papers for the masthead values, but they're maybe not aware of how detached they are from the values of the employees or those who are writing. And so I'm trying to kind of rebalance that and make the values of the masthead and the people who write under those under that masthead to be more and more aligned. So that's a key thing. And then the other thing I think is also segmentation, and the kind of eternal kind of friction between, or rather conflict between wanting more eyeballs and wanting to sort of really spread the message out there, but also having high quality information that can be, especially for financial markets, actionable. There's a conflict, I think, between those two things, because sometimes if you're catering to an informed market, it's very easy for a story like that to kind of go viral and get like misrepresented by the pack who isn't as informed about a specific market. And then that's what creates this massive, often feedback, negative feedback, and makes you risk averse in the future and stops you from sort of speaking truth to power because you're scared of like the broader message being misconstrued. So it's a balance, and with the blind spot, I'm trying to kind of maintain a pathway that basically bridges sensitive information with the ability to speak to as many people as possible when the message is when it makes sense. So I want to bridge it with a subscriber model with advertising to boot. And then the big plan is to then kind of be the minimum viable product that then creates a sort of network effect for other organizations who lead on a values first basis. And so we can then club together as values first organizations and kind of forge guilds based on these values. And then consumers can then, almost like a credit agency for certain networks. And if you meet the values and specifications, you get to be in the guild. It's a self-regulatory idea based on the fact that at the moment journalism is very much regulated on a national basis. And I think in the kind of internet world where everything is international and borderless, we need a new system that can transcend a lot of the kind of jurisdictional norms that travels like beyond borders, basically.
That's interesting because you could say that government's almost going against that and they're trying to take more control over what people say, especially, I guess, journalists and how they say it. And as you said, that's where we've seen almost sometimes the extreme come to the forefront because some of those conversations aren't being had in the mainstream media.
Yes. And I think one of the issues is this idea of like, the platforms get to dictate the terms and what is acceptable speech and what isn't. Whereas I don't think that's a good approach to communication or information sharing. I think it's better if the organizations like self-declare what their values are. And as a community, it's sort of the values are established by the users, not by the platforms. So there is obviously like a minimum criteria of values, right, where it's based on the laws of the country where the platform is hosted. But I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about like obvious legal and illegal speech like incitement to violence and things like that. I'm talking about the more subjective values that are presented by YouTube or other, big platforms, which are based around what they dictate as credible or not credible or whatever. So I think the way to approach that is through a self-declared approach to values by the journalistic organizations. And if you are in breach of your own values, you can get kicked out of your little guild, right? In that way, as opposed to the current situation, which I would say is a sort of guilty until proven innocent model. So if you're on YouTube or on Twitter and you write something that is potentially deemed unacceptable, you get booted off, and then you have to appeal, and then you have to prove that you're innocent, right? Whereas what I want to do is create a system where you're innocent until proven guilty. So if you say something contentious, it's up to the objector to provide the evidence that you have broken your own rules. Like, so if the objector can prove that as a community you broke your own rules, then there's you get ejected from the community. But it's like in finance, as long as the reader knows what they're getting, I don't think it should matter where you are on the spectrum. So if you know, like, you're a one-sided activist journalistic outfit, well, that's fine, because you've declared that to the users, right? The problem for me are the people who declare themselves as neutral but actually aren't, right? So that's the vision. Whether it manifests again, as I said, we will see. But I figured if I don't try, I will always kick myself. So that was the idea behind it all.
Yeah. Well, I guess, was there a time, was it like a specific news thing for Financial Times or something that happened where you're like, hang on, we should be talking about this, and that sort of helped you to make the jump? Or?
Well, I don't want to be, I really value the Financial Times. I think that, as a community of journalists, I think they're some of the most talented people I've ever worked with. They're very tenacious. And I think, generally speaking, the Financial Times has incredibly great standards. But I also think that they are not immune to much wider forces that are actually sort of influencing all the mainstream media. They're not necessarily forces that are coming from editorial. They're often forces coming from the commercial side and sort of the audience engagement side and the developer side, and also actually from non-editorial entities who politicize a lot of the content, right? And I think there should be a really extreme war between editorial and different divisions. So back in the day, I think, unions at the, journalistic unions were very much usually minded on like getting better terms and conditions for journalists. They weren't so much focused on sort of cultural matters related to sort of X, Y, or Z being like ESG being we must champion ESG values or something like, or environmentalism or whatever. That wasn't a union type thing. And I think what's happened is that as social media has sort of become such a big influence across all sorts of corporations internally, these like employees who've not necessarily come into the organization aligned with the values kind of see themselves as capable of influencing the management to change the values of the organizations that they have entered into, rather than starting their own competing ventures that like have their own values transparently on the masthead. So that's what I think is happening. Specifically, for me, I was very disappointed with how late we were to covering the lab leak story. I thought it was very I couldn't understand why there was a lot of hesitance towards that. I was also very disappointed. I've been public about this, and I think anyone who read my Twitter feed at the time would have also picked up on the fact that I was very disappointed in us not questioning some of the kind of economic implications of lockdown more seriously and the kind of trade-offs associated with it. And I was very disappointed that everything became a very binary conversation where you're with us or against us. And I personally believe in the spirit of debate and, in addressing the more controversial ideas head on, rather than just shying away from them or putting, your head in the sand. So those were the main issues. And, as time, in the last, I don't think it helped that work from home became the norm, because I think journalists really thrive on those interactions in the office and being able to kind of like read each other's body language in terms of certain controversial topics or whatever, you're less likely to get pissed off of your colleagues when you're face to face with them around the water cooler. But when everyone's operating through Slack, it gets a bit testy, and I think that didn't help the dynamics. So everything became very bifurcated, and people were either on board the kind of like view of what was going on like the consensus view on Slack, or they were a bit ostracized and couldn't find themselves challenging it in a way that didn't piss people off. And so the dialogue just got suspended, and I think we could feel that in the coverage that manifested. So this all disappointed me, and I as someone who is very open to debate and I would say like a radical centrist who tries to be, who doesn't have a prescribed political perspective, I think even though some people will say I do, but I would argue I don't, I found I wanted to break free into a more actually liberal environment where I could tackle things on a point by point basis, rather than coming at it with foregone conclusions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sort of the same, where I like, for some reason, I'm always trying to think of the opposite perspective and then like almost go at people with that, just to test, so you're almost like testing their hypothesis, see what they say. And then from there you can think about, okay, is what they're saying, does it resonate with me, or do I think that's interesting, or, maybe I don't agree with what they're saying.
That's exactly right. And I think that's very much the approach that Alphaville used to always have. It was that we were kind of like a hedge for the FT. So if the consensus was X, and we would challenge it from the other perspective. And often we were right, because it turns out like, markets are such a consensus based sort of phenomenon, right? That often being anti-consensus helps you see things ahead of time. And I think that's how we learn, and how we, if an idea is the right, if a policy or an investment strategy or whatever it is, or a corporate business model is the correct one, right, it should withstand scrutiny. And I think we all benefit from scrutiny. So when it comes to sort of more controversial topics like Trump or Brexit, sometimes my issue with the mainstream press isn't that they were too harsh on Trump or too harsh on the Brexiteers. It's that we were too forgiving of the other side, right? And I think we should have an equally I think, the cliche incident now is the Hunter Biden laptop, right? What that would never have, if that had been Trump, you would never have got away with it. So why is this happening? And I think the feedback I often get is, oh, well, these days, in the current sort of situation, to not be one-sided is just, it's actually an immoral thing, because it's so obvious the right and the wrong. You have to be on the right side. It's either with us or against us. But I say no. I think especially if you're writing about finance and capital markets, you can't get swept up by the ideology, because at the end of the day, capital is sort of ideology agnostic. And consider the current Ukraine and Russia conflict. It's very easy to kind of like get swept up in the propaganda, and obviously there is propaganda coming from Russia, and it's really obvious and incredibly one-sided. But at the same time, we are also doing our own white propaganda, and I think that's fine. I get the purpose of it. I understand why we're doing it. But as an investor, I don't think you can get swept up in it, because if you believe your own propaganda, you suffer from the blowback. So you might end up thinking we're doing much better in the war than we really are. And if that's the case, you might start investing in leisure stocks, because you think the war is going to be over soon and we should be like, jetting off on holidays. And then you underinvest in defense stocks. And then lo and behold, it transpires that actually you're not doing as well as you thought. And the defense sector, you haven't got enough, like, whatever, guns and weapons and MiG-20, whatever plane. I'm not, you know what I mean, MiG-28s or whatever they're called. And that's the blind spot, right? And that's what I want to talk about. It's like, I think you have to be dispassionate sometimes, because good capital allocation wins wars too.
Yeah, it's vital. And I guess you could say we've seen that the last few months with, many people had these rhetorics about certain companies, or, you could even say the Fed was transitory. And, it's always trust the experts. They know what they're doing. They're right. But it's like, hang on, we need to, as you said, we need to have this conversation in case they're not. Otherwise, if we're all going one way, there's going to be massive consequences if it doesn't happen.
Yeah, everyone benefits from having a contingency and from stress testing. That's the whole point of stress testing things. You have to assume that maybe your projection for X is not going to happen, and then maybe worst case scenarios is actually the one that manifests what would happen in that scenario. I think that's just logical. That's just a logical approach to the market. But sadly, that has become taboo, and that is very concerning to me. And you mentioned the inflation conversation. I mean, you wouldn't think that it would apply to inflation, but it really did, and it became taboo to even raise the prospect of inflation not being transitory. And that also was one of the reasons. I left for many reasons, but I did think that it was strange to be in an environment where just challenging the inflation narrative was seen as somehow like out of step with your moral duty. I do think that is weird.
Yeah, it's just saying, there's no right or wrong, but we have to try and challenge these, ideas just to make sure that no matter what happens, we're ready for all considerations.
Yeah, exactly. Being on the contrarian side has, in the last few years, actually benefited investors, because it's quite clear to me that there is some sort of like breakdown in how information is traveling through the system because of these pressure groups in all sorts of organizations. And that is manufacturing a bit of a disreality, and you can't put reality off. Reality always, at the end of the day, gravity is real. And no matter how much you want to believe that that you can fly, if you step out the window, you will fall down and kill yourself. And I think that is, markets are a little bit swept up in this disreality. And of course, like when it comes to inflation, you have to remember that the central bankers have no incentive whatsoever to be honest about it. Like it is, we forget that the markets are a confidence machine, right? And the central bankers know that they are involved in a bit of theater. Like it's well understood that animal spirits really dictate what's going on. And the central bankers would be actually like negligent if they were going out there and saying, oh yeah, inflation is going to be a problem, because they would just be feeding the inflationary beast, right? So they have a duty to lie to us. And I think it's it's up to smart commentators to see through that. It's like Kremlinology, or you have to read between the lines of what they're really saying. And they're saying transitory inflation, but they're actually saying, we hope it's going to be transitory. And as long as we kind of come up with these other ways of talking about it, maybe it will be, but we're going to talk it down, because there's no upside from saying there's going to be inflation.
Yeah, and as you said, it's the psychology where if they say there's inflation, people will buy more products now, or they'll go try and get more wage increases. And that's, as you said, it becomes like inherent in people's beliefs, which is not what they want. So they're trying to do the opposite to that.
Yeah, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like with Northern Rock when it was, floundering. There's a big debate whether Robert Peston was right to report on it. Like a lot of people thought he was wrong to do it, because in a way, even though he was being honest and reporting on the market, there is, a school of thought that says that he actually played a role in manifesting the crisis. Now, of course, in hindsight, I think we all know that there was a terrible misallocation, and whether Robert Peston talked it up or not was kind of, irrelevant. Like in the long run, like that misallocation was happening, right? But so much of like economic management by the central bank is to do with kicking the can down the road and putting things off until we have like a safety net to be able to pick, to manage any fallout, right? It's about like we can reallocate, but we have to do it smoothly and in a sort of ordered way, right? So that's what they're responsible for. And I do think journalists do have a duty to not like over egg things, don't get me wrong. But I think at the same time, a responsible journalist would know how to communicate the truth in a measured way, but without necessarily having to kind of completely indulge in the disreality at the same time.
Yeah, sorry, I laughed when you said orderly and the Fed. It sort of made me laugh about what they're doing at the moment. It's not very orderly, unfortunately, but
exactly, which is a shame. But that's kind of because so much of they've had, we've called their bluff at this point, and was it the right strategy for them to deploy? I think in hindsight, there should, it all goes back to COVID. It all goes back to like the original trade-offs with the economy. I mean, in reality, it all goes back to 2008, but it didn't help that we just suspended the economy. And I'm not in the camp that says we should have done nothing. That's not my take at all. My take is that we should have just been a bit more measured about it. We should have allowed more sort of a bit more autonomy in terms of personal decision making. And for a lot of like Sweden, I think Sweden was the right model. It's not like they did nothing. They just put the onus on like the citizens to make decisions based on their own circumstances. There's not been a lot of academic analysis of the trade-offs, but there was that one piece not long ago by his name escapes me now, famous economist, more on the kind of Austrian side, I believe, is it Steve Hank, who did the report into COVID trade-offs. But again, that's it's presented as a one-sided thing, but the problem is no one on the other side is doing the work. So I think it's really important that people who see things differently approach the same topics from similar perspectives, just to debunk them. And when it came to the lab leak, that was definitely my approach. It was like there seemed to be a lot of credible circumstantial evidence that suggested that perhaps it wasn't a natural origin. And what mystified me was, why was the press not looking at it, like even to debunk it, because the conspiracy channels had gone down that road, right? And in many cases they were going completely, nutso. But there was enough like credible evidence for us to look into it, and at the very least debunk it as a thing. But we didn't even try to do that. We just ignored it for over a year, and it seemed very bizarre to me that was the case. So when things started leaking out, or rather the Overton window started to widen, and the discussion about it became normalized. I think now it's become totally normalized to talk about the lab leak thing. But even then, it was an incredibly kind of painful experience trying to get any stuff, even the historical stuff out. I mean, it seemed very, the system didn't want to hear it. And that puzzled me and disappointed me.
Yeah, definitely. So if we go to today, and I guess things that you're looking at, and could be finance, could be anything. Are there any news pieces that you think aren't being covered by the mainstream media that you think should be?
I think there's a whole lot of things. I think one of the kind of uncomfortable truths is that Russia isn't as in terms of the Ukraine conflict. Obviously, there's the fact that it's an obvious proxy war between NATO, Russia, and potentially China. I actually think maybe it's a proxy war between China and NATO. And this, I mean, more recently, this has become more normalized to say, but it wasn't like 2 months ago. And then I think there is also this uncomfortable truth that Ukraine doesn't stand a chance unless effectively we come in and provide arms and support and enter the war properly, right? And that in itself, I think, is being underreported. So we're trying to have our cake and eat it on that front. And I think from a markets perspective, even though World War III is being slightly more priced in, it took a very long time for that to be priced in. the other big story is on commodities and this idea that we can handle the sanctions, because I personally think I don't think it's going to be as smooth sailing as people are suggesting. I think that the dollar is really going to, at the very least, become part of a multipolar kind of reserve system from now on. There's going to be a massive bifurcation in terms of the way we fund commerce. It's not going to just be dollar denominated, and that will have cost implications for everybody. And I think inflation and in terms of reshoring a lot of production, I mean, it's going to be a long time before these pressures ease off, and that will have a cost of living crisis that has still not been properly priced in. So I think at the moment, the market is underplaying how big a structural kind of transformation this is going to be. And then there are other sort of compartmentalized areas of commodities that are being, where we're not really very upfront about our disadvantage vis-a-vis China and Russia. I think generally speaking, Russia's commodity strength is being underplayed. These are things we can adjust to, but it's going to take time. And the idea that we can just pull out of buying Russian gas and oil overnight without serious implications, I think is quite naive. So I'm looking towards, I also think we need to be quite, upfront about the role the ESG system played in misaligning our investments and making us energy insecure. I think that was also potentially fed by Russian interests. Actually, I think there was a lot of, there's a lot of credible evidence to suggest that, one of the people, like, it's not a new concept that, like, during the Soviet Union, Russia would be kind of encouraging the anti-nuclear lobbies and all the kind of anti-oil and gas lobbies because they benefited from it, right? So I wouldn't be surprised that was the case. And then I think other things include the role that how inflation will influence a lot of new kind of corporate business models that have never experienced inflation. I think there's a lot of them that have never been tested by inflation. This will especially apply to some of the fintechs. So we will see what happens. But I suspect at the moment, there is still this kind of like growth mentality to a lot of these stocks. That era, I think, is over, and we still aren't talking about it, like what the implications are going to be for that of the market. Because I suspect there'll be a big reallocation from the sort of leisure. When I say leisure, I mean the sort of everything from Spotify to even Uber and Deliveroo, I would call like leisure to some degree. It's a business model that works, or Peloton or things like that. These business models work in times of sort of excess when we have an embarrassment of riches, as they say. Whereas in tougher times when commodities are going to be tight, it's going to be, I think a lot of those business models will struggle and they will have a growth collapse. We're already seeing it with Netflix, obviously, and people pulling subscriptions. I think there's more to come on that front.
Yeah, wow, we covered so many things there, which is really interesting. And then, I just talked to someone called Tavi Costa, who's sort of into commodities. And that was the thing that I found really interesting, the fact that there's so many of these global trends occurring, like, deglobalization, where people are going to need all this, manufacturing onshore. And then you mentioned there ESG, and you mentioned all these other things. And it's like, hang on, we probably can't, we probably don't actually have the materials for every country to do this and to become maybe self-sufficient on renewable energy, especially in the short term, because it would just massively increase a lot of the costs. So I guess that's a concern. And, you mentioned there, Russia's trying to convince people not to use nuclear. And, for me, the first thing that came to my head was Chernobyl. And you don't want to go crazy with this, but, I guess that was something that probably really influenced a lot of people, especially in Europe, to maybe push away from that focus.
Yeah, I mean, nuclear is, the future as far as I'm concerned. And It's incredible that we're now sitting here in a situation where we're energy constrained, and Germany is having to mothball all these nuclear plants, and we've had no real reinvestment. I believe like France is suffering a lot of shutdowns at the moment as well. So this is incredible to my mind, when actually the best pathway out of the crisis is through investment in nuclear. Nuclear technology has come so far since, all the plants we have are decades old. And actually there's a lot of technology on what you might describe as, I'm not a physicist, so please forgive me. As far as I understand, there's a lot of advancement in what kind of like battery type nuclear cells, where rather than having there's no meltdown risk with these, because there isn't, like, where the energy doesn't come out on a kind of on a fluctuating basis. It's preloaded into these cells and then released. So there isn't that sort of reactor issue. So there's a lot of potential in that. And then, the wind, and I'm concerned, I have to say, about this idea that, oh, well, we can like disconnect from Russian oil and gas because it drives the net zero agenda, and we can just invest in wind and solar. Well, I'm not so convinced that that technology is yet at a state where it can plug that gap. And actually, to the contrary, I think it's becoming clear that without access to cheap fossil fuel, we can't fund that transition. And it's very strange, because for years it was established sort of common understanding that nat gas would be the essential transition fuel, that we would have to go through this period of nat gas dominance as those other technologies kind of really caught up with the needs of the market, right? But with net zero doctrine, we've just decided to pull the plug on nat gas development, which is crazy, because there's just no way we can achieve the kind of transition in terms of funding it. Like, all those renewables have to be made, and if you use renewable energy to make renewable energy, like, there has to be a net surplus amount of energy, and they're not capable of doing that, especially once transmission costs and the actual kind of like intermittency issue is factored in. It's just not cost effective on the same level as fossil fuels. So we need to burn that carbon, and nat gas is much more energy like efficient than burning oil and like oil and coal, right? So the idea behind the natural gas transition was even though it's still a fossil fuel, it's a much cleaner fossil fuel. You still get gains in terms of you get sort of efficiencies that in terms of carbon emissions. It's not a total, we did actually start to see these emissions fall down. Just pulling oil and coal out of the picture really helps matters. But now, because we went cold turkey, we're having to go back into coal, which is crazy. Like, that is the worst scenario of all. And that's the sort of thing that I want, to say these stories, even in the FT, like before this became transparently obvious, was incredibly taboo, and you couldn't say that. And I know authors who did try to say this, and the backlash was so immense that discussions may have been had to flag their content with a trigger warning. I mean, this is absurd.
Yeah, and I guess it just shows you, and for a lot of these people as well, it's almost in their best interest not to say things, because then will it look bad poorly on them within the company? I guess that's another concern for probably a lot of the journalists.
Yes, and I think we have a duty in the journalistic profession to stress test things. And fine, if after 2 years all your critiques come to nothing, fine. But no one is worse off for that, because if you find a weakness through that like critical analysis, then it can be flagged and addressed. Whereas if you completely can't, if you're not allowed to critique anything, well, there's going to be gaps in the logic somewhere, and they won't be addressed, and instead it'll be a massive sort of like crisis when something that should have been caught much earlier on is not caught because we couldn't criticize it.
Yeah, it's vital. So, Izabella, thank you so much for joining the podcast. And I guess on to my last question, what is one message you want people to take away from our interview?
That is a good question. I think just to be more open-minded and tolerant of other perspectives. I like to think of things from an anthropological point of view. I think we all benefit from trying to step into other people's perspectives, because know your enemy, is actually a worthwhile, way to operate in the market. If you don't know your enemy, you're never going to outdo them. So just for the sake of knowing their perspective, read broadly, be tolerant, but be critical as well. That's my main message.
Yeah, it's vital, especially in this day and age. And we've seen people who have been critical, they've been affected the past few months in the markets, especially. So, Izabella, thanks again. So we've mentioned the blind spot. Where else can people find you if they want to learn more about yourself?
I'm on Twitter on at Izabella Kaminska, Izakaminska, and my website is, unfortunately, the blind spot. It like the perfect URL was not available. So until I make gazillions and I can buy it out from, I think, that blind manufacturers, it's the blind spot, which is one word, blindspot.com. So I did get a .com, but there's an annoying hyphen between the and the blind spot. So yeah, if you could just suffer that for the time being, that's where you can find me.
Yeah, perfect. I'll put that on the description below. Yeah, I've had the same. I have to do like what the finance online or something. So it's like funny ways around it. But yeah, Izabella, thanks again.
No, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.